I think we need to recognize that increasingly economies are all about people and their labor force. It's nice if you had them to have commodities, but you've got to notice that commodity prices have been on a long-term downtrend in their prices for the last 40 years, and they're prone to huge cycles. They happen to be in one of those down cycles right now. And a lot of places you don't have access to natural resources, so until we discover oil underneath the Parliament buildings, Ottawa in particular is going to be all about people, and even if we did have oil, it's only worth $50 a barrel right now and be hardly worthwhile destroying the Parliament buildings for. So it really comes back to that one thing, it's about people and how productively you can put them together, and how productively you can put them together, not just to serve their own domestic market, but increasingly how productive you can put them together to enter and compete in a global economy. And that is particularly the reality for Canada right now, or through our history. We've got a pretty simple economic model. We hooked our train onto the locomotive of the United States, and that worked pretty well. It was a big economy, rapidly growing, but its growth rate in the future is not going to be all that rapid. Europe's hardly growing at all. They're an older labor force than we are. They're not going to grow very rapidly. So increasingly, we have to change our economic model as well. We can't have 90% of our trade, if we want to thrive, go to the United States and Europe anymore. We have to diversify that, and we've been very slow about that. So obviously you can say there's a hook there coming to the immigration market that I'm going to come back. So it's all about people. On paper, we got the right type of people. If you look at the percentage of people who have some form of post-secondary education, we're the highest within the OECD. The 35 countries are the wealthiest in the world. We don't put them together very well. Our productivity is not very good. It hasn't been very good in Canada since the 60s and 70s, so we've got some challenges coming forward. I was going to speak a little bit about the economics of labor markets and particularly immigration, and I figured that was pretty safe grounds because I looked at the program. I was following a politician who would have known he was a better economist than me, and he covered a lot of that stuff. But I noticed he wasn't particularly political, so take advantage of your opportunity. So that offers me, particularly since he's not here to hear what I say about it, to get in a little bit of the politics of immigration as well. So we're okay. We've still got some material to go through. So obviously immigration is a big deal. It's a big deal for Canada. It's a big deal for Ontario. It's a big deal for Ottawa in particular. It's probably hardly anyone in this room who himself has not come from somewhere else, or their parents or their grandparents. We're almost all immigrants, just depending on what kind of generation you go back to. The numbers are huge. People always throw around there's 250,000 people come to Canada. Well, that's not really quite right. If you put in temporary foreign workers and refugees, it's closer to 350,000 a year. And Canada's population is around 35 million, so math is pretty simple. That's 1% of our population comes from immigration every year. What else is 1%? Well, Canada's growth in the labor force is 1%. Interesting coincidence. So if you do some mathematical twisting and turning of that, and just imagine as a mathematical proposition, not as a policy statement, but just at the moment that we didn't have any immigrants, Canada's labor force would be flat. In other words, without immigration, our birth rate will be exactly matched by the death rate and about 80,000 people who leave Canada every year. So immigration is the entire net labor force growth in Canada. The biggest growth flow, of course, is young people coming out of high schools and universities and colleges into the labor market, but then they're offset by older people moving it out, and that's kind of a net flow as well. So all of the net and growth action is coming in immigration. It will be more than all of the growth in 5 or 10 years because we'll be that much older, that much closer to the baby boomer generation coming to full retirement, and then more than all of the growth will be that. It's not quite that in Ottawa, but in the last 10 years, immigration's been half of the labor force growth. So even in a jurisdiction that gets 6,000 or 7,000 of those 250,000 immigrants, it still is a huge macroeconomic factor. It's a huge factor in directing growth. And I hear all kinds of statements about how that's the growth of the economies and it does this and that in the economy. And I think, well, that is true in an absolute and a gross sense, but that's not really what matters. Surely what matters is what happens to output, or more particularly income per person. If we doubled the Canadian population from 35 million to 70 million tomorrow, and that exactly doubled our incomes, would that really do us any good? Everybody would have exactly the same income. It would just be twice as many of us, presumably more congestion. That's not what we really want. The objective function is surely to increase the average median incomes and have a proper distribution. And there's where immigration is not working in our favor, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, and that's because of the challenges of immigrants of earning the kind of incomes that Canadian-borns are earning and how that has changed over time. So again, as a mathematical statement, definitely not as a value statement, immigration is actually acting to lower average incomes in Canada, and it has for the last couple of decades. Doesn't need to be that way, shouldn't be that way. We should change that, but that's been the reality, and that hasn't been, if it's been recognized, I think it hasn't been appropriately responded to. So let me just come back a little bit to what that means in the Ottawa situation, because Ottawa is a very unique labor market. It's unique on both an economist term on the demand side and the supply side. So it has the highest percentage of jobs in the Ottawa market that require some form of post-secondary education. Fortunately, on the supply side, that coincides. We actually have the highest percentage of the population with some form of post-secondary education. So in a very glib sense, there's at least a match between a high demand for skilled, educated people and a high supply. And this organization and others will lament, as they should, the fact that 1/10 of the skilled, highly educated immigrants are working in a level of a job that doesn't fully meet their training. That is the lowest number of any major city in Canada. So again, it's unacceptably bad situation, but the labor market still works relatively well in Ottawa. And as I said, immigration certainly is not as big a factor in the net population growth here as it is elsewhere, but it's still a huge factor. Why is such a high skill? Well, I don't want to oversimplify the labor market, but obviously there's two sectors that pull way above their weight, one being public administration. I don't just mean the federal government and very important hospital sectors and other services sector within Ottawa, and then of course we have a very big high-tech sector. And of course, a lot of people who are not familiar with Ottawa say, well, that was ancient history. That sort of went with 2001 with Nortel. There's actually more people working in that sector now than there were at its height. There is not as big a conglomeration and a small number of companies, but there's been a proliferation in the number of companies with a smaller average workforce. But that sector, in terms of human resources, is bigger at the moment than it ever was. And it has high-level requirements for skills. That's what drives this high level of demand. And again, we have skilled workers, but nonetheless, about 1/3 of employers in Ottawa note year in and year out they have difficulty hiring skilled workers. So there is an issue to be sorted out here. Is immigration the answer? Well, historically it seemed to be so. So if we go back a long way in history, one of the things, it's very rare that you'll hear an economist speak at anything that most of us not will lament that we got lousy data and we don't know what's going on. That's actually not the case in immigration. We have long been blessed with great statistics and data. And in fact, we have longitudinal studies on immigrants that can track what's happened to them every 5 years. So you can pick someone who came in 1961 and we can still track what's happened to them every 5 years going through that period. And this is when they come back to policy, this is why it's shocking and totally unacceptable we haven't had an earlier and more appropriate policy response to the difficulties of immigration, because we actually know what causes difficulties and we actually know what leads to success, but we haven't really matched that up. So until 1981, the statistics were fairly predictable, fairly stable, that when they came, immigrants tend to earn about 80% of what a Canadian-born, and within 5 or 10 years, they caught up and in many cases exceeded the earnings of the Canadian-born. This all changed since then, and the gaps have been getting bigger in both sense. The gap on arrival in earnings has been getting wider, and it's been taking longer and longer to have any catch-up, to the point that for immigrants who came in 1991, and of course we've only got a couple of decades to follow them, are not catching up, and in fact the catch-up process is tending to largely hold back. So for example, if we take immigrants who come to Ontario, with post-secondary education, of men, they earn about 50% of what a Canadian-born would earn working in Ontario, and females only earn 40%. So roughly about half what the situation was back in 1981, and they're not catching up. They get some gap closing, but not nearly coming back up. That same. So what's changed since 1981? Well, the biggest thing is the source of immigration. And up until and including 1981, the vast majority of immigrants into Canada, Ontario, and Ottawa came from the United States and Europe, particularly in the case of Europe, from the British Isles. Well, that wasn't that challenging to integrate people. First of all, they came from educational institutions that were fairly similar to us. If you saw they took Economics 101, hey, I know what that's all about. They probably used the same textbook as somebody did here. Of course, most of them would have English or French as a first and second language. That was easy to integrate. They tended to work in companies we were very familiar with. You could call their employer. That person would speak your language. You could have an understanding and a recognition of what their foreign work experience was, and you tended to give full credit for it. That, of course, has shifted. Those are no longer the dominant sources where our immigrants. The person is more likely to come from someone in the Caribbean, Africa, and increasingly Asia. So language is one of the first issues. We're not familiar with their educational institution. They may not have taken their education in a first or a second degree in English or French. We're often not familiar with their employers. You may get a list of referrals that you can call. They may not speak English or French. You don't connect with them. You don't know what to make out of this. And we do know, and again, we got great data on this. We got all surveys. We know what employers do in that situation. When in doubt, they give zero credit. If there's a doubt that 10 or 15 years of experience was relevant, give nothing. If in doubt whether that BA or that master's is comparable to here, give nothing for that. Hey, it's a risk-averse type of reaction. That's understandable. So that's what's moved away. So you can cut this in all kinds of different ways. So why have those earnings coming down? Well, one is totally by the source of where the immigrants have come. So studies have, for example, looked at the rates of return to foreign education by country, and when you do it by country, they've not changed. So the rate of return from an immigrant coming to Canada, who has been educated in the United States or the Great Britain or wherever else in Asia, is the same as it was going back to 1981, but the weights have shifted. The weights have shifted to countries where the rates of return were a lot lower. That, of course, has to be linked together, though, with language. And in fact, if you look for people with high school education, and on average across all females, differences in language abilities accounts for the entire deterioration in earnings of immigrants into Canada and Ontario since 1981. It accounts for about half of the difference for males coming in, a little bit less weighted. But so obviously there's reasons that we can pinpoint of what's leading to success and what has caused difficulties. So chief among those difficulties is obviously language, recognition or failure to recognition foreign experience. We have struggled mightily everywhere across Canada in foreign credit recognition. We have made some steps recently to improve that process, including looking at credential recognition before the immigrant came. Why that didn't send a light off in somebody's brain 20 years ago instead of just recently is beyond my comprehension, but at least we're beginning that. Because the trap we typically filled in is somebody's missing 1 or 2 credits and you just send them back to start all over again. Well, guess what? They don't tend to do that. That's what leads them to go into some kind of occupation, which is belief their training aspect of it. So these are aspects that could be addressed by policy. So what has policy been doing on this? Well, not very much. So if we put it in its most simplistic form, how would we characterize our immigration system? And I would use the word passive. It's passive in the sense that in Canada, historically, we have evaluated and ultimately accepted or rejected people who happen to apply to come here. We do not seek people, we do not recruit people. I would look at a system, for example, Australia, which would be at the other extreme. Australia's system, the whole process starts by a survey of employers. Who do you need? Where are your labor market shortages? Oh, pipe fitters, okay. We'll send a message to all our embassies and our consulates around the world, go find pipe fitters. And if you're working in an Australian embassy, wherever in Europe or Russia, you will get an instruction, hey, try to draw in some pipe fighters. Well, if we were missing pipe fighters, we might get one or some, but that would only because they happened to come into an embassy or consulate and ask to enter the process. We actually couldn't even do that system right at the moment because we do not have a very good view in Canada of what kind of labor demands that we need. This is part, the joke was that weather is the federal responsibility, and the minister gave a little bit of a shot at the federal government for handling immigration, but also noted they were working in cooperation. This is one of the classic casualties in our relatively dysfunctional federalism system. Nobody is in charge in this area. No ministry, no level of government has taken it upon themselves to define what we need, which is why, and there's been references, we've had this debate in the last couple of years of a so-called skills mismatch, a so-called skills match. Hey, maybe, I don't know, nobody measures that. We've got a job vacancy survey, but it's only at a provincial level. It's kind of useless, really. If you're an engineer and you're looking for a job in Ontario, it might tell you there's an engineering job, but off the top of my head, I can think of 8 types of engineering, and it's a big province. I don't know which of those 8 types of engineering that's in, and I have no idea whether it's in Windsor or Ottawa or Timmins. Hey, good luck to you trying to fill that kind of job. I know many of you here in the high-tech and the IT sector, and that surprises me because that's been an area, one of the loudest, speaking about this difficulty of finding skilled workers and the so-called shortage in those workers. And I guess as an economist, the first thing I look at when I look at that is our wages responding. Hey, there's demand and supply. If something is in short supply, the price of it goes up. In this case, the wage goes up. And actually, that hasn't happened. If you look at what's happened to wages in Canada since 2001, there's been almost no differentiation by industry, by sector. So the median wage has gone up 3.1%, and the so-called hot areas of employment, wages have gone up about 3.3 to 3.4, and the ones that have been dead, stone cold dead, they've gone up about 2.5 to 2.6. That's kind of a weird response as well. I also think if you come back and look at Canada's colleges and universities, take IT. Now, a fair bit of IT would come from computer science training. 20 years ago, only 20% of the computer science students in Canada's colleges and universities were female. Today, what do you think it is? It's 10%. It's half what it was 20 years ago. Why as a sector, you're working with half of the workforce? That seems really weird to me. Engineering is another one. Again, if you look at the scant information we have on the job vacancy survey, it's always one of the hotter areas where we're working. Well, 16% of the engineering students in Canada's universities are female. And that has been unchanged since 40 years ago. That goes right back to high school. Females get turned off by sciences and math in high school. And other than a few pilot projects, no one's ever changed that. And I just don't get that. Why don't you realize there's a problem and work back at the source, change that through the high school system, change that through the college and universities, change the image? Sorry for the shot of the IT sector, but I know it's me, maybe it's just me. Ask me my image of somebody working in the IT sector. I will, in my mind, have an image of a geek, always male, because that's who works in the sector, hunched over a keyboard doing some primary coding. Well, if you look at the sector's 5 to 10 year labor demands, 2/3 of them have nothing to do with that. They're in management and marketing and the other types of things that can draw the labor force. Hey, we got a problem here. That's a problem at the sector level. We got a problem at the government's level. So I always look for an opportunity. There's no better opportunity than when my buddy here, Rick Miner's here. So in 2008, Rick and I and 3 other commissioners were asked by all the governments in Canada to look at labor market information in Canada. And we gave a report. It had 69 recommendations in it. We were astutely aware of what's the downfall of all kinds of reports in the past. They take governments that are having hard fiscal times and they throw out proposals that are going to cost billions of dollars. The entire cost of our 69 recommendations was $49 million per year spread across 13 governments. That wasn't an excuse. I guess I'm biased. How could I not be biased? I look at back, we reported in the spring of 2009, 69 recommendations. I look back at it, I'm still 100% convinced they were absolutely brilliant. And if they'd been put in place, we wouldn't even have had the skills match. We would have known exactly what we were talking about, and we probably would have had the action. They were all eminently practical. Rick told me his count is that, stretching it a bit, 10 of the 69 got recommended. I think he's more generous than I would say 2 definitively got implemented, and on the verge, maybe 3 or 4. It's pathetic. We got doomed, of course, because we were created by an entity called the Forum of Labor Market Ministers, which is the labor market ministers, the federal government, and all the provinces and territories. It was, in my view, I'll call it what I saw it at that time, and it still is, a completely dysfunctional group. And they proved it. They actually canceled the meeting that we were to present our report, and they've met twice since then. Once just this last fall. They actually went for 6 years and only met once. Labor market information used to be done by the federal government, and the federal government kind of logically said, well, when we devolved almost all the labor market powers to the provinces, the last of them being handed in 2007, it doesn't make any sense for us to do the labor market information, so we're out of the game. Some of the provinces picked it up with respect to their own province. None of it picked it up from a pan-Canadian perspective. And it's interesting how you get involved in things from other ends of it. So the Ontario government, through colleges, universities, and training, actually has a contract with a big consulting company about setting up their own labor market information system, which would be better than we got right now, but we don't actually need 13 completely separate labor market information systems. We actually need something to go together. This would help on the immigration front. Faster response on the policy side, again, looking back, what causes the difficulty on the economic and social integration? Well, language comes at the first. So our language test was an interesting, only people who have taken the old French language training exam in the federal government would know what I'm talking about. The old one is before the heavy influence got put on the interview. It was, you read a text and there's multiple choices afterwards, and it's actually been proven that any educated person could pass that almost 100% and not have any comprehension of French whatsoever. That was our language test for immigrants. It had nothing to do with their ability to speak or understand English. And of course, the French language test in the federal government immensely changed when they started doing interviews, and in fact, in the first 6 months it got implemented, 2/3 of the people failed, even people that have been close to getting an exemption. Well, that's changed. We've now increased the points to it. We've increased the points for age, because particularly it's difficult to get jobs at an appropriate level for older people. But we still don't really know the sectors and the occupations that we need and the sectors that can come in, and so we still don't have that. And I know I sort of feel like a big brotherhood sort of all manage this stuff, but we do need that, and it's really information. It's not really that much on the big brother front. So I think we've got a mess. We've had a mess for a long time on the immigration front. We have a huge potential. Canada is an attractive location for an awful lot of people. It could have been a spark for the Canadian economy. It definitely has not been. And anybody tells you that, and they tell you the contribution to the GDP, always ask them, hey, how about the contribution per capita? That's actually lowering it. And then the federal government recently cut the integration settlement numbers, adjustment numbers for Ontario, because they said you don't have as big a percentage of immigrants. And they said that's because all the jobs are in the West. Well, that's nonsense. The reason they did it is the federal government arbitrarily capped the number of foreign skilled worker programs that could come in. That's the one program that was actually working well. And Ontario, with no say, faced a capping on that. And that's why the immigrants went elsewhere. But they complained in a minor fashion about it, but they did nothing about it. You know, from the federal government, I look at the contrast. Well, in the early 1990s, the entire immigration operation was devolved to the Quebec government. And in fact, when we did the infamous program review in the 1990s, we got constitutional advice. We couldn't even cut the federal government transfers to Quebec because that was viewed as a quasi-constitutional transfer of powers. So they got it all. They got an increased share of the federal government money as everybody else got cut back, and Ontario got 500 people. And he says, okay, it got subsequently increased to 1,000. He says it's 5,200. That's a tiny part. Now, again, this is a second best. This first best would be the federal government to clean up its own act and improve the parameters. But if they're not going to fully do that, then we should improve the provincial nomination programs. Hopefully they're well integrated. We do know on the provinces that make extensive use of the provincial nomination programs, the results are better, particularly in Manitoba. And a big feature of that is the very early connection with employers, to the extent that many of the people coming on those provincial nomination programs already have a job secured before they come. And that is, of course, a key determinant of that success. The other thing I found was really interesting when I was doing the interviews with the minister's department, I was relating a story that happened to me in 2009 at the federal level. So in the 2007 budget, the federal government had created a new fund for language training services for recent immigrants, and they allocated $400 million for it. And 2 years after that, I was curious how well that was working, so I called the Citizen Immigration at the federal level, and they said, we have no idea. All we've measured in the program is how much we've spent, and we can tell you we spent exactly $400 million, not 1 penny less, not 1 penny more. But we did not do a pre-course language evaluation, we did not do a post-course language evaluation, and we didn't take attendance. So we have absolutely no idea what happened to the $400 million. And I was telling this story to the Ontario Ministry's deputy minister and assistant deputy minister, and they were obviously visibly uncomfortable when I was telling the story. I'm not very astute to things like that. It was pretty obvious that something was bothering them as I was going through the story. And I said, well, what's wrong? And they said, well, we have a program, we do exactly the same thing. We have no idea what happens to our money and what the end results are. I mean, like, come on. Let's go back to the beginning. This is the biggest thing driving the labor market and the economy of Canada. And you run a program in that way? Oh my goodness, that is so disturbing. That's where you people come in. So if the governments aren't going to get it right, somebody's got to get it right. I'm going to talk first about from the perspective of the immigrants and then from the perspective of the employer. So from the perspective of immigrants, you're the biggest thing that can happen, because we know the biggest thing for success is connecting to an employer, which will lead to a job. The biggest thing to do is, if they're missing something in a language skill, is not for the government to have a program in which they don't even evaluate it and don't even take attendance, but for the employer to do that. So to give you an example of this, you're probably familiar with a group called Allies. Allies works across Canada helping groups like this to facilitate immigrants getting hired. And they found that after 12 months of mentoring with an employer, the unemployment rate for a skilled immigrant is reduced by 73%, and their earnings are increased by 60%, and 71% on the end of 12 months will be working in a field that meets their occupational and education background. Hey, that's pretty good. They're in lines of success. But I got to tell you, after working on all kinds of different policy areas, I've come to the definitive conclusion you can never understand anything by reading all the research and sitting in your office. You have to see it and feel it to know it. And I did not understand what went on until I had a personal participation in this. So in Toronto at that time, when I worked for the TD Bank, there was Career Bridge, which has morphed into TRIAC, and that took skilled, highly educated immigrants who actually passed an English fluency test before they were eligible, and it gave them 4 to 6 months postings and willing employers. And I had a few of them come in my group in TD Economics. And I went in there kind of full of myself, thinking I held a fair bit of sway. I will have these people for 4 or 6 months, and I will help land them great jobs. Nope. That certainly brought me down, but more importantly, it brought them down. So you look on paper, both of these people, one from China, one from Bangladesh, both had bachelors from their host country, and by coincidence, a master's from the same university in Australia. So I actually had an English educational master's. Their English was okay, but it wasn't great. You could see the flaws orally, fairly major flaws in the writing part of it, but really, really smart people and very dedicated. First gentleman, no job at the end of it. Finally got him a job through a temporary agency as a call center, and that disappeared after 6 months, and he went back to stocking shelves in an import-export company he had before. Although there was a kind of happy ending, because the Toronto Star actually did a feature on him when he was with me. And 3 years afterwards, the journalist from the Toronto Star contacted me and wanted to do a follow-up. And I said, you know, he and I regularly exchanged emails for about 2 years after this, and I think he just got so discouraged by the whole thing, he just dropped out of sight. I had no idea what happened to him. But I gave her his name, and she said, she was a very good journalist, and she said, that name is very common in a particular area of China, and they have an association in Toronto. I bet they could tell me where he is. And today, he's got a pretty senior job at the Bank of Montreal. So it was difficult, but it worked. The other one, having gone through this experience with my eyes somewhat wider open and how little influence I had on the world, I knew I was going to have to try a lot harder. So my second gentleman, I actually helped him apply for 43 jobs before he got one. He almost always got to the last 5. He quite often got to the last 2, but he never got picked. And every single case when I followed it up, there was somebody whose language skills were stronger and somebody with Canadian experience, and it was very interesting. He finally did get one, but before he did that, he had a wife and 2 children and a third one on the way. He was delivering pizza, and we sat in my office one day and did the math of it because he was using his own car, and we worked out he was making $4.50 an hour. That kind of breaks your heart when you realize that, and all the efforts that he went to. That too, though, ultimately had a happy ending. He did get a job. And he's now working for the Ministry of Finance in the Ontario government, and he's received a number of promotions, but boy, is that tough. And it also points to some of the challenges here on that language issue. And I don't know if you have the same kind of experience as Scotiabank, but I think, I don't think it's any accident that your major sponsor is Scotiabank, and I'm sure they're doing it because it's the right thing and a good thing to do, but let's face it, it's also business. This is something I was always preaching at TD. I mean, if immigrants are the sole source of net labor force growth, guess what? They're the only source of new banking clients as well. So whether it's a good thing or the right thing, this is where all your business is. And again, I don't know what Scotiabank is, but if you plot on a map where all the new branches of TD have gone in the last 5 years, guess what? They're all in geographical locations where immigrant populations are congested. And they're all based upon having people work in there that are comfortable in that space and have the language of that. That's where it really needs to drive it. But there are cultural issues, and it was really interesting, my interactions with the gentleman from Bangladesh. He did two things that drove me crazy. First of all, he would always stand up when I went into his office, and he would never sit down the entire time I was there, and he would not stop calling me Mr. Drummond. And to this day, when I hear Mr. Drummond, I always look behind my shoulder, wondering why my father is standing there. I have never seen myself as Mr. Drummond. I'm Don. That's all it's ever been, and he would not stop doing that. But after a while, I thought, it's a typical thing in stress management or how you deal with your children. Your first question, is this a big deal or a little deal? No, this is not a big deal. And the second thing, I always looked at the perspective, he made me uncomfortable. But if I insisted he sat down and called me Don within months of first knowing me, he would feel uncomfortable. Why am I just looking at it from my perspective? It doesn't matter to me. He's standing up. Big deal. I can still talk to him. We can have a conversation. Big deal. He wants to call me Mr. Drummond. That eventually changed, but not until he felt that he knew me quite well, because that was the culture that he worked in. It didn't really matter to me, and I thought I was being silly on that thing, but that could have been a factor in whether I was comfortable or not. So coming back to the TD and this, TD, one of the most fun things I did at TD is they opened up every piece of data in their human resources, and they asked me to do an economics assessment of the human resources at TD Bank, and I found it was fascinating. Pretty good representation across ethnics and country of origin, but totally misrepresentative as you got at the senior management groups. And we had people with mother tongues from all around the world, relatively well balanced with our population groups and our clientele group. But what we were noticing when we talked to the branch managers is that there's a bank speak. And no one ever wants to acknowledge this, but whatever field you work in, you have your own language. And if we were a gathering of economists, and I was speaking to a bunch of economists, I would use terms that I'm not using here, and everybody else would use this, and if you are not economists, would have no idea what we're talking about. And I would do the same thing if you're a bunch of physicists and speaking, or if you're a bunch of medical professional people, I'd have no idea what you're talking about. Everybody's got that. we've got that in the banking community. Even me, having worked 23 years at the federal government and then gone into banking, at the beginning I faced a type of language I wasn't particularly familiar with, and that's exactly what they had. So we actually created programs at George Brown's College and Ryerson University to teach bank speak to people who were actually quite fluent, and that was an amazing success. And we did actually surveys of the people on their degree of comfort of operating in their jobs after that, and the thing went way up. Wasn't a big deal. It really wasn't very expensive relative to human resources, but it's something that really turned it around. I just wanted to mention it from your perspective. Yeah, again, I mentioned, and by the way, Frank could probably answer a question to me. So I do a lot of work in health policy. And I always wonder, hey, this is frustrating on labor market information. Why do governments actually not take the lead in health policy reform? And I think the number one obstacle is the Canadian public wrongly thinks we've got a great health policy system because we're trained from birth to uniquely compare ourselves to the United States. And we got one thing that we do better than them, and we just gloat over it. We're cheaper than them, and we don't have their own insurance and stuff. And how do you break in as a politician? I'm here to fix your healthcare system. Well, excuse me, there's nothing that needs to be fixed. So as usual in a political campaign, I've done a slogan, and I'm kind of jealous as a TD guy of Scotiabank's, you're richer than you think. So my slogan for health policy is you're sicker than you think. Would that require a copyright payment, I think, to Scotiabank? It might be a problem. It might also define why I've never been into politics and probably should stay in the bureaucrats. So my lead speaker, I want to fix your healthcare system because you're sicker than you think, might not go anywhere. But, what does this mean? TD recognizes, and I'm sure Scotiabanks and others recognize it. What does it mean for you? Well, again, high requirement for education. So yeah, 6,000 to 7,000 immigrants coming into Ottawa per year. That's a big thing. It's half of the net labor force growth. But consider this, 27% of the people in Ottawa who have some form of post-secondary education are immigrants. 37% of the people in Ottawa have masters or immigrants. 56% of the people in Ottawa have doctorates. I always feel like some personal insight because it says earned doctorates, and somebody who has an honorary doctorate, that was written exclusively to exclude me. And it's like, I'm sorry, but you did not write any exams, you did not do a comprehensive, and you didn't do a thesis. So that's somebody else. That's not me. Well, 57%. So you're looking to the skilled labor market. That's where they are. They're in that immigration pool that is available, but it's not being properly used. And it's always nice, again, not just to look at the abstract statistics, but look at the real life cases. So, right there on the great website from Ottawa, HIO Immigrants Ottawa, is that statistics 95% of the Ottawa employers who have hired a skilled immigrant are satisfied with the experience, or pleased actually with the system. We actually can parse that down even further. TRIAC in 2011 commissioned ECOS to do a survey of exactly this, of the people connected with TRIAC. What was your experience? And the first thing was, why did you hire an immigrant? And the three most common reasons were to crack into a new market in some other geographical location. Hey, that makes sense. If I want to crack into the Chinese market, pretty hard to do it with people who've never even been there. How about getting somebody to do that? And I really like the story of Dominic D'Alessandro when he was a CEO of Manulife. So Manulife is an exception in Canada. They're one of the few financial institutions that has a big presence in China. And at that time, they were applying for their license to sell life insurance in China in conjunction with a Chinese-based firm. And Dominic found out that the woman in the Chinese bureaucracy, who essentially had the complete say of whether to get the license, was a graduate of Western Ontario, University of Western Ontario. And there's absolutely no evidence that had any sway on it, but he said, I just felt really happy when I heard that, because there was somebody that knew my company, that knew the Canadian financial brand. That's the kind of thing, those are the kind of connections that you need. So in that case, 83% of the companies that had hired somebody with that in mind would have been satisfied with their experience, pleased with their system. A second most common reason is they noted their competitor next door was hiring immigrants, and that was making their business thrive, so let's copy that. And about 90% of those were satisfied. And the third one is that they just had some kind of niche requirement, and they were unable to find those people in the regular markets. And again, the score was over 90% of the people that are satisfied in that. So you can kind of put those together. We know definitively it helps the economic and social integration of the immigrant to have that involvement of the employer, to give them a job, to help out in that credit recognition process, to help out in the language. And we know definitively from the aggregate statistics and the survey of employers really, really are happy with their decision to hire immigrants. So let's hope we sort out the aggregate problem. We get a decent labor market information system in Canada. We identify where our needs are, and that information feeds into the colleges and universities. Just one other final anecdote on that. I had the opportunity to speak to the Canadian Ministers of Education last summer in Charlottetown. 150 people, about the same size as the room of this. Every single one of those people specialized in education or labor markets. That's what they did every single minute of their life. And I asked them, if a 15-year-old asked you tonight, what would be my expected income and employment prospects from various different courses I could take at college and university, would you know where to find the information? I wasn't even asking them, do you know the answer? Just, would you know where to find the information? And 6 out of 150 said yes. So 144 people who work in that field every single day did not know the answer. And my response to that was, I want to talk to the 6 of you after, because the information doesn't exist. I want to know what the hell you're going to tell. What kind of nonsense you're going to tell this 15-year-old. When we were doing the labor market information, we thought, well, what do young people do? So we posed this question of, what would a 15-year-old do if he was asked the question what a plumber makes? Because I still think it's all about information. I think one of the reasons we don't have people taking these skilled trainings is they have no idea what the income prospects are. That somebody who's articling an electrician can make $40,000 or $50,000 when they're articling. With some overtime, and you can make $80,000 or $100,000. I couldn't do it because I'd electrocute myself on the first day. I have empirical evidence of that. But other people, I think, could do that. So we asked that question. You know what they did? They texted other people. And invariably, they would text a friend who lived in Halifax, whose brother was a plumber. And they'd get one sample, and they'd say, oh, it's $40 an hour, because there's one person. And that's kind of interesting. We thought that was kind of cute, because the young people are so sophisticated and have all this information, and we figured that they would look at some kind of survey, even though they didn't exist, or at least try to find some. But all they did, it was from their social network. And invariably their answers are way off the map, and that person made above or average, but they took that as an indicative. So we got to fix up the policy scene on this. And I was telling Rick before that my unfortunate counterparts in the Forum of Labor Market Ministers have basically done nothing in the 6 years since we did our report, contacted me a week ago and essentially said in the introduction, and we decided maybe we should do something about your report and the lack of good labor market information, so we want to talk to you about this 6 years after we did the report. Hey, better late than never. Hopefully you can fix that up. Hopefully we can go, we've had some improvements in the immigration settlement and selection process at the federal level. Hopefully that can improve. I got to tell you, the minister's here, I'd say to him, I would get out that network movie and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. You can't continue to have Ontario just pushed around and accept whatever happens to the federal. They should have a better system themselves on both the selection and the integration process. But the biggest thing is you as the employers, that's where it's going to do. That's what's going to improve the economic and social life of immigrants. But that's also what's going to improve your business. And I'll end there. Thank you.